Russia is facing a crisis the Kremlin never saw coming. Across the country, Russian soldiers, military families, and even former loyalist mercenaries are openly defying Vladimir Putin's orders, refusing to fight in Ukraine. What began as quiet whispers of dissent has erupted into a full-blown rebellion against the Kremlin, as ordinary Russians finally say enough is enough. For over 3.5 years, Putin promised a swift, special military operation, a short, glorified campaign to liberate Ukraine. Mothers were told their sons would serve for weeks, if at all. Now, over 1 million Russian men have been killed or wounded. Tens of thousands more have disappeared from service records, and the anger inside Russia is boiling over. The first signs of unrest were subtle. Soldiers began finding ways to avoid frontline deployment, filing medical complaints, self-inflicting injuries, or simply going AWOL. By late 2023, reports of mass desertions began to surface, though the Kremlin dismissed them as isolated incidents. That denial has long since evaporated. Today, soldiers are actively refusing orders, entire units are abandoning positions, and in some cases, troops are surrendering en masse to Ukrainian forces, often without a fight. According to Ukrainian military intelligence, as of August 2025, more than 35,000 Russian soldiers have surrendered voluntarily, with the actual number likely far higher. The method of surrender has evolved. What started as individual soldiers quietly approaching Ukrainian checkpoints has turned into coordinated operations facilitated by the Ukrainian I Want to Live hotline, a system designed to safely extract Russian troops who no longer want to die for Putin's ambitions. Tens of millions of Russians have visited the site, many searching in secret from inside Russia, a sign of just how deep the dissent runs. But it isn't only the soldiers themselves. Russian families have begun mobilizing in unprecedented ways. In Moscow, St. Petersburg, and dozens of smaller cities, military wives and mothers have staged protests outside government buildings, waving signs pleading for the return of their husbands and sons. Some protests have drawn thousands, others remain small but symbolically powerful. The movement, known as Bring Them Home, has over 50,000 followers on Telegram alone, mostly women connected to mobilized soldiers. The Kremlin has tried to dismiss these protests as foreign-inspired or politically motivated, yet polling data tells a different story. Nearly 64% of Russians now favor immediate peace negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, the highest level of public opposition since the conflict began. Among young adults aged 18 to 29, opposition rises to nearly 70%. This isn't just discontent, it's a full-scale domestic rejection of Putin's policies. Soldiers have found inventive ways to avoid combat, sometimes shocking in their audacity. In 2024 and 2025, multiple reports confirm that Russian paratroopers deliberately shot themselves in limbs to secure medical evacuation. Entire units have abandoned posts, leaving equipment and heavy artillery behind, while commanders either flee or attempt damage control. In Kursk, during a single Ukrainian operation, over 120 soldiers surrendered simultaneously, dropping weapons and walking directly toward Ukrainian lines with white flags. Their commanders had vanished hours earlier. This mass defiance isn't just a military problem, it's a political catastrophe. Even Putin's private military contractors are showing cracks in loyalty. In late 2024, Wagner Group operatives, some of Russia's most feared mercenaries, staged public protests over poor leadership, heavy casualties, and unpaid wages. While no immediate armed rebellion followed, the symbolic significance is immense. Those who once enforced Putin's will are questioning his authority. Meanwhile, the human toll inside Russia is staggering. Casualty estimates suggest that over 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded since the invasion began in February 2022. Independent Russian sources and Western intelligence agencies agree. At least 250,000 dead and over 750,000 wounded. These losses dwarf any military engagement Russia has faced since World War II and surpass all Soviet conflicts combined, including Afghanistan and Chechnya. Yet Putin's forces have gained almost nothing. In the past year, Russian advances have measured mere meters per day in contested zones, slower than infantry advances in World War I. The territory seized amounts to barely 1% of Ukraine's land, trading 1 million casualties for less than 5,000 square kilometers, an area roughly the size of Delaware. Economic strain compounds the social unrest. Russia now spends nearly 40% of its federal budget on defense, an unsustainable level that crowds out basic services and devastates civilian life. Factories churn day and night producing tanks, missiles, and artillery, only to see them destroyed in Ukrainian counterstrikes within weeks. Inflation has skyrocketed, interest rates are at record highs, and everyday Russians are struggling to survive while the state funnels resources into an unwinnable war. Putin's propaganda machine portrays victory and patriotic duty, but on the streets of Moscow and the villages of Dagestan, Chechnya, and Tuva, the reality is painfully clear. Russia is bleeding, and citizens are starting to fight back in ways Putin cannot control. The erosion of trust is accelerating. In 2025, former loyalists who once executed Putin's orders have spoken out publicly. Igor Girkin, former FSB officer and architect of Russia's Donbass operations, called Putin incompetent and a danger to the nation. Yevgeny Prigozhin, a former chef turned mercenary commander, staged armed protests highlighting military corruption, forcing Putin to negotiate rather than risk a civil war. Even generals are openly criticizing operational failures, some disappearing under mysterious circumstances, others quietly dismissed. Putin's once iron grip on power now relies on fear and isolation, yet neither can stop a wave of rebellion fueled by desperation and anger. Russian soldiers, wives, and mothers are united not by ideology, but by survival. Every day brings new stories of defiance: soldiers refusing deployment, entire families protesting, young men fleeing abroad, and communities demanding their loved ones back. The Kremlin has attempted crackdowns, arrests, and propaganda campaigns, but public sentiment cannot be jailed. This is not a small-scale uprising. It is the systematic erosion of domestic support for Putin's war. The images are stark: mothers kneeling outside defense ministry gates, toddlers holding signs pleading for their father's return, units surrendering en masse, mercenaries marching against state orders. The message is unmistakable. Russians no longer trust Putin, and they are refusing to die for his delusions. The consequences for Russia are already unfolding. Military readiness is declining as experienced troops desert and conscripts are unwilling to fight. Economic pressure is mounting as resources are diverted to a war that yields nothing. Public unrest is spreading to previously loyal regions. International observers warn that the combination of internal dissent, battlefield failures, and social upheaval could destabilize Russia in ways unseen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin's response has been predictably harsh but ineffective. Arrests, prosecutions, and even executions have failed to stem the tide. Military courts have processed tens of thousands of cases for desertion, yet each punitive measure only fuels resentment. Soldiers increasingly see the risk of execution as a lesser evil compared to dying for a cause they do not believe in. And the protests continue. Grassroots movements, armed and unarmed, are calling out the war for what it is: a slaughter driven by ego, ambition, and incompetence. This is a turning point. For the first time, the Kremlin faces a rebellion not from Western powers, not from politicians, but from the Russian people themselves. Ordinary citizens, military families, and soldiers are united in their refusal to continue feeding the war machine. The Russian state, once feared for its absolute control, is witnessing cracks that deepen daily. And the question now is no longer whether Putin can win the war in Ukraine, it's whether he can survive the collapse of his own country from within.
Anything Russia has seen in decades. Soldiers are no longer hiding their refusal. They are making it public. In Belgorod, units simply abandoned their posts after days without supplies or medical support. Russian social media, though heavily censored, is filled with videos of troops marching away from the front lines, leaving armored vehicles behind, waving white flags. The Kremlin has attempted to suppress these reports, but the sheer volume of leaks and the growing network of sympathetic insiders make containment nearly impossible. In many cases, commanding officers are either complicit or powerless. Reports indicate that dozens of units have refused orders to engage in offensive operations, claiming that they will not fight until their families are guaranteed safety. The Russian Defense Ministry has threatened punishment, but fear alone cannot stop a wave born of desperation. Mothers are at the forefront of this uprising. In cities like Vladikavkaz, Grozny, and Makhachkala, large groups of women have organized protests outside recruitment centers, demanding the immediate return of their sons. Many of them bring photographs of missing or deceased soldiers, making their pleas impossible to ignore. Some have chained themselves to fences outside military installations. Others have blocked roads, refusing to allow transport of troops to frontline regions. Russian state media has largely ignored these demonstrations, but international outlets have broadcast them widely, amplifying the humiliation for Putin and the Kremlin. The psychological impact on the soldiers is profound. Entire units report morale at near zero. Some troops have confessed in leaked communications that they see no reason to fight for a government that disregards their lives. Officers are frustrated, desperate to maintain discipline, but unable to enforce it without risking mutiny. The rebellion is spreading rapidly because the cost of compliance has become unbearable. For months, Russian soldiers have endured horrific conditions: minimal food, insufficient ammunition, constant artillery bombardments, and the knowledge that their commanders lie about reinforcements and air support. Psychological trauma is widespread. Russian military psychologists estimate that up to 70% of troops deployed in Ukraine are experiencing combat-related stress, yet the official response has been punitive rather than supportive. Soldiers who request medical evacuation or psychological counseling are often accused of cowardice or treason. Meanwhile, reports indicate that conscripts as young as 18 are still being sent to the front lines with barely any training. Russian families, many of whom were assured their sons would only serve briefly, are now openly accusing the